Good evening, all. Tonight in ethics, we are talking about the ethical theories of Soren Kierkegaard, frequently taken to be the first existentialist. His summative quotation is, "The only absolute either or is the choice between good and evil." So Kierkegaard is not a systematic philosopher. And what do we mean by that? We mean, are deontological thinkers systematic? Consequentialists, systematic. Virtue theorists, systematic. He's going to do something different. And so he's going to give us kind of this anxiety, this ennui, kind of a listlessness or boredom. Dread, guilt, absurdity, paradox, and the critical importance of the life-defining choice are all things that characterize existentialism. So let me just start this with a disclaimer. Kierkegaard is going to make a lot of assertions that you might view as attacking the Christian religion. Okay? Please keep in mind, he's not attacking the religion as such, but rather the way he views people as practicing their religion. Also, you could just as easily, if it makes you uncomfortable, substitute any other religion, political ideology, sports team allegiance, and so on every time he mentions Christianity. So please keep an open mind while you're reading him and give him a chance. So Kierkegaard is kind of repelled by what he views as orthodox, small o orthodox religion, as well as by reasonableness. Okay? Kierkegaard's convinced that Christianity is fundamentally absurd. In fact, all belief, if we come right down to it, is fundamentally absurd because we're asking you to take something as true while not necessarily providing you with any tangible evidence to believe that. Now, a lot of people say, well, okay, that's it, I'm an atheist. In fact, we're going to see a philosopher that has exactly that. Kierkegaard goes the opposite direction and says, no, the fact that there's no reason to believe it, and yet I do, that's its compelling attraction. And really, he's got a point, because you can't be converted to a belief in anything by being convinced of its truth through a logical argument. Instead, he says, kind of like Abraham, you have to make a leap of faith. So what's that going to look like? Kierkegaard is a deeply religious philosopher, a very pious Christian, and his existentialist thought is devoted to the question, what does it mean to be, or rather to become, a Christian? And in that sense, existentialism isn't an anti-religious philosophy or an unspiritual philosophy. It can and often does embrace a belief in God, and really it's the only thing that can be called legitimately spiritual but not religious, which is kind of the approach that Friedrich Nietzsche is going to take in it. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about existentialism as a theory unto itself, and then we'll sort of circle around and come back to what we read in Kierkegaard. So the whole idea in existentialism is every single one of us as an individual is responsible. There really is no corporate existence in existentialism. You're not the member of a family, not the member of a race, not the member of a country, not the member of a school, or any of that kind of stuff. So you're responsible for what you do, for who you are, for the way that you face and deal with the world. Ultimately, you're responsible for the way the world is. If you think the world sucks and it's a crappy place, why do you allow it to continue to be one, asks the existentialist. So life might be difficult, circumstances might be impossible, obstacles, which you probably put in your own way, emotions, characters, limited means of intelligence. Nevertheless, we are responsible. We can't blame God for this. We can't blame nature for this. We can't blame the way the world is. But the existentialist would say, if there is a God, you choose to believe in him, her, it, they, whatever you like, okay? If nature made you a certain way, it's up for you to decide what you're going to do with what nature has given us. You know, if you've seen the show Game of Thrones, and if you haven't, you're missing out on some good literature and television. Tyrion Lannister, he's an ugly little dwarf. His own family hates him. They're trying to kill him, but hey, he's rocking it. He's making the best of it. I will urge you to see The African Queen, in which this very priggish Katharine Hepburn says to a very vulgar Humphrey Bogart, nature, Mr. Allnut, is what we are put upon this earth to rise above. So existentialism we might think of as kind of a movement or a sensibility in the history of Western philosophy. And this is my cat, Gunter. He's a good boy. Okay. The central themes in existentialism are the significance of the individual, the importance of passion, the irrational aspects of life, and the importance of human freedom. Gunter, come on, take the hint, buddy. No, don't show people that. Okay. So it's not necessarily a gloomy or a dark philosophy. It can be very invigorating or positive. It's also not necessarily atheistic or a kind of secular humanism. As Kierkegaard's going to show us, it can be deeply religious. The three major themes that we see in existentialism are a strong emphasis on the individual, although that's going to be variously defined and understood by different people. the central role of the passions as opposed to the usual philosophical emphasis on reason and rationality. The emphasis is on a passionate commitment. For the existentialist, if you're going to live at all, you had better live passionately. And the importance of human freedom. Existentialists are concerned with personal freedom, also political freedom, free will. That's central to Kierkegaard and Sartre, not so much to Nietzsche. And this relationship between freedom and reason is particularly at issue. Traditionally speaking, if you were rational, you were free, while if you acted emotionally, you were kind of a slave to your passions. This is going to turn that around. Kierkegaard's notion of passionate commitment to something is central. So what does it mean to exist? Obviously, existentialism, existence, is going to be one of those central tenets. Kierkegaard's going to define that as a life that's filled with passion, self-understanding, and personal commitment. Whereas Nietzsche is going to tell us to really exist is to manifest your talents and your virtues, become the person you are. And the key to existentialism general sensibility is this notion of contingency. And this is where we get a little bit weird. What if you had never been born? What if you had been born at a different place, at a different time, as a different person, or possibly not at all? If you've ever read Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis, you get a really striking sense of this. And if you haven't read it, go out, get yourself a copy of Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis. It's only about 100 pages. You can read it in the weekend, and it's really, really good. The opening line of the book is, one morning, Gregor Samsa awoke to discover that he had been turned into a gigantic insect. And it just gets stranger from there. And his biggest concern is not, wow, how am I going to face my friends and family like this, but how am I going to get to work? And so existentialism really urges you to live your life to the fullest, although what that means to individuals is going to take on very different forms. Okay? You can read, if you like, in more detail what Kierkegaard's issues with religion are. He rejects the idea that being born into a religion is sufficient to be one. And usually says that, you know, it's easier to become one if you weren't born into one. And we do find with most religions that converts tend to have the best success in that religion. And Christianity, it's a commitment. It's not something to which you can passively adhere. Requires prayer, requires fasting, requires attendance, requires a lot of things of you that are not simple, that you can't just passively do. He says most Christians display no passion for their faith at all. And so really he's looking for you to show him how you believe and why you believe. And so subjective truth, you being the subject, is the central element in a meaningful life and an ethical life for Kierkegaard. Because there's only subjective answers to the question, how should I live? You can't tell me how to live. I can't tell you how to live. I have to find that out for myself. Subjectivity then becomes one of inwardness and passion. It's this personal choice kind of taking hold of your life by committing yourself passionately to whatever you choose. Now for Kierkegaard, this was Christianity, but it doesn't have to be. You could passionately choose the Cincinnati Bengals. You could passionately choose the flying spaghetti monster, touched by his noodly appendage, boiled for our sins, ramen. So it really doesn't matter what you want to passionately commit yourself to, so long as you commit yourself to something. Now, religious belief requires faith, and faith is not rational, but it does involve passion and commitment. So the paradoxes of most religions, instead of making the faith less plausible, actually are required to provoke the passion that faith requires. Within Christianity, you've got concepts like the incarnation, the atonement, the resurrection, the ascension, none of which really jive with our reason and rationality, but which are required as doctrinal and dogmatic beliefs of that faith. Christianity and existence more general involves a lot of inwardness. Religious passion, therefore, can't be collectivized into an organized religion. I mean, you might be there going through the same motions, standing, sitting, kneeling, whatever, but there's no way of knowing what the person next to you is thinking. They might be doing the exact same things while thinking about balancing their checkbook, and here you are having a tremendously moving religious experience. Now, here's the good part. Because there's no correct form of subjectivity, it kind of remains up to you as the subject to figure it out for yourself. And to a subjective author like Kierkegaard, to kind of seduce his readers. He's sort of pulling you in. His writings are an elaborate seduction. You can coax, but you can't argue someone into an authentic existence. So our first key concept for him, the aesthetic versus the ethical. Now, generally speaking, when we say aesthetics within philosophy, we mean that which is pleasing to our senses. It looks nice, smells nice, tastes nice, feels nice, etc. Sounds nice, okay? the aesthetic and the ethical represent two modes of existence for Kierkegaard. To live aesthetically is to immerse yourself in the immediate, the sensory, the momentary. If you're an impulse shopper, you find yourself at HEB, you've got everything on your list, provided you made a list. I usually walk through, look at ingredients and go, I think I'll make this tonight. But nonetheless, you've got your cart full, you get up there to the checkout, and you are surrounded by soda waters, candy, maybe magazines. And you go, oh, I want to get a whatchamacallit and grab a, I don't know, what are they drinking these days? A Monster, and read about Caitlyn Jenner. I don't know, okay? That would be an impulsivity. I tend to be very impulsive, mostly when I'm at the bookstore, but I've also bought furniture on impulse. That's a story for another day. To live ethically, on the other hand, is to commit yourself to a framework within which good and evil have significance. And that's really the only way that you can live as a responsible agent, says Kierkegaard. Now, some of this, he's borrowing over from Immanuel Kant, different part that we did not look at, Kant's pure categories of the understanding. Where he gives categories of quantity, like unity, one, plurality, two or more, totality, all of them. Categories of quality, reality, negation, limitation. It does exist, it can't exist, it exists up to this point. Categories of modality, possibility, existence, and necessity. It could exist, it does exist, it must exist. And then finally, categories of relation, inherence, causality, community, correlation, things like that. Okay. Second key concept for Kierkegaard is this notion of the universal. This is the idea that ethics is in these rational social norms that apply to all of us. Now, this might seem strange when just a minute ago he was talking about you doing you and being very subjective. He says, well, yes, but we've still got to exist in society, and there are some things that you're just going to have to take upon and do for yourself. Teleology, he's interested in it not in the way that we've used the word. Remember, telos means end, aim, plan, goal, design, outcome, or consequences. He's interested in, can we teleologically suspend the ethical? That is, can we put our ethics on hold, or our social norms on hold, or our etiquette on hold, if it's to serve a higher value, for instance, to obey our duty to God? All right, so I asked you to read little scraps of things, and Kierkegaard wrote in a really interesting way. A lot of his writings are actually in journals, and most of those titles are given in the place where he happened to be when he wrote that thing down. So the first thing I asked you to read was in Galilee. And this doesn't fit really well with a lot of what we've read, because they're just kind of, hey, did you ever think of it this way sort of things. So he says, the thing to understand myself, the thing is to find a truth which is true for me, the idea for which I can live and die. So we might reflect on this, that a lot of people say they would die for, you know, their family, their country, their faith, whatever. Why aren't they living for those same things? He says, so to construct a world in which I did not live, but only held up to the view of others. So we've got to be careful that we're not just going through the motions and making a facade, that we're not putting on a play for people, and that we really do behave the way in which we say we behave. And there's an imperative, so note that he's using that Kantian language there, of understanding that I've got to take it through and take it up into my life. So he's got to take these ethics and practically apply them. Now in the either or, he gives us a little more food for thought. He says, you know, there's a lot of times in life where it would be ridiculous to use an either or it would be an instance of madness. I could even get myself into dreadful contrasts, like if I'm picking between virtues, for instance, or trying to pick between vices. Ideally, on the virtue sense, you say, I'll take them both. On the vice sense, you go, I don't want either of them. And he gives a very good point here that I mentioned at the outset of the year. I listened with childish trust to the talk of my elders, and the instant of choice was solemn and venerable. Although in choosing, I was only following the instructions of another person. That kind of brings us back around to the question of, when do your ethics actually become your ethics and not just you doing something that you were told to do in that situation? Now he says there's only one situation where the either or has absolute significance. When truth, righteousness, and holiness are on one side, lust, base propensities, obscure passions, and perdition are on the other side. He says it's important to choose rightly, because that one choice, you might have to beat a retreat back to that point at some point. And he says, maybe if God is asking you, hey, how did you get to this point? You want to be able to say, this is how I got to that point. And he says, be foolish to say that it's ever too late to choose. But in that choice, the personality, it immerses itself in the thing chosen. If you do a good thing, you are the person who does good things. If you do a bad thing, you're the person who does bad things. And that says a lot about you in that situation and moving forward. And the longer we postpone the choice, the easier it is for us to alter our character. So we're back in the grocery line. Now maybe we don't get the whatchamacallit, maybe we get the special dark Snickers. Maybe instead of the monster, we want a Bang. Maybe instead of reading about Caitlyn Jenner, we want to check out what's going on TV or over in Syria. The more we delay, the more choices we're presented with, the more difficult the decision is. So what happens then is we make the choice more difficult. And he says, we're kind of like a captain on a ship. I can either do this or that. So imagine you are a captain on a ship. I won't subject you to the terrible music video, Captain and Tennille Muskrat Love. You can look that up on YouTube on your own. I do make my face-to-face classes watch part of it, and it scars them for life. Okay, you're a captain on a ship. There's a storm coming up. You can either steer the boat towards shore and try and take refuge, but you might be smashed on the rocks. Or you can go out into the open ocean a little bit, but you might be swept out into the open sea. What do? You can't not choose, because if you don't choose, the storm's going to choose for you. It's either going to sweep you into the rocks or out to sea. There's no longer a question of an either or, not because you've chosen, but because you've neglected to choose. And Kierkegaard says this is essentially the same as saying you have lost yourself. In other words, what comprises yourself is your ability and your capacity to choose. So the act of choosing is this expression of the ethical. The aesthetic choice is either immediate, we grab that candy bar, that magazine, that energy drink, or it loses itself in the varied options that we have available to us there in the checkout line. The ethical choice, in a way, is a lot easier because you just got two options, but in another sense, it's infinitely harder because in choosing that, you're marking yourself as the kind of person who chooses that sort of thing. And so he says we're interested in kind of a pathos with which we choose. We remember studying that alongside ethos and logos, no doubt, in literature class. Pathos in Greek means like a yearning, a striving, a desperation. We got to do it. And the personality is consolidated in this choice. We mark ourselves as the good person, the bad person. And it's really kind of the energy with which we choose, says Kierkegaard. Now he says like a Cato. Cato was a renowned Roman orator who was probably a real jerk, like known for telling people, you're stupid and shouldn't speak in public, go sit back down. He says, like a Cato, I shout at you, for my soul has not yet acquired the resigned coldness which he possessed. In other words, he wants to yell us and shake us out of this, but he doesn't. He says, I've got this earnestness of spirit. And then he tells us, perhaps you will succeed without much in accomplishing much, perhaps even in astonishing the world, for I am not niggardly, and yet you will miss the highest thing, the only thing which truly has significance. Perhaps you will gain the whole world and lose your own self. Now, a couple of notes on the term niggardly. This is not included to offend you, but rather to introduce you to a word that you probably haven't encountered before, but that you may encounter if you read the works of Charles Dickens or Abraham Lincoln or a number of writers from the late 19th century. It has absolutely no, connection to the racial pejorative terms, despite its unfortunate homophonic similarity. It comes from Old Norse. It means to be cheap, to be miserly, to be greedy. Just so you know, I still don't recommend probably using it, but there you go. Now you know what it is. So Kierkegaard asks, what is it that I distinguish in this either or? Is it good and evil? And he goes, no. He's bringing us up to the point where the choice between good and evil really acquires significance to us. Now he says, if we can get you to stand at the crossways in such a position that there's no recourse but to choose, you'll always choose right. Now, does that mean you'll always choose the right and ethical thing? Well, no, not necessarily, because clearly history shows that we don't always do that. And yet, we are choosing what we feel is right for us. We're either living aesthetically or we're living ethically. And he introduces this term, a character indelibilis. It's a Latin term that shows up in both Catholic sacraments and numismatics. So in the sacraments, you have an indelible character. When you are baptized, when you're confirmed, when you're ordained, they're irreversible. You can't undo it. Although there was a guy a couple of years ago apparently selling unbaptism certificates in England and making a pretty good living off of it. And they're unrepeatable. You can't be baptized over and over. You can't be confirmed over and over. You can't be ordained over and over. In numismatics, which is coin collecting, when we stamp a coin, it's indelible. It can't be wiped away. And so it marks it as a quarter or a half dollar or what have you. So there you go. Now, the final thing we want to think about with either or, if you've never seen Scarface, you owe it to yourself to see the movie Scarface. It is an Al Pacino classic. It is probably De Palma's third best film. Highly recommend that you see Scarface. I'm going to spoil it for you, however, so apologize in advance. Now, he tells us it would be of very little use to man if he were to gain the whole world and lose himself. Now, in the final scene of Scarface, and you're still going to want to see it, even if I've spoiled it for you, Tony Montana now has everything. He's got the hot wife in Michelle Pfeiffer. He's got the huge house in his mansion that is being invaded by Colombian drug lords. He's got the good best friend, but wait, he just killed the best friend who thought, because he thought he was sleeping with his sister when they were actually married. Now the sister hates him and all he wanted to do was support her. So he's being chased through his house by Colombian drug lords. That's the famous "say hello to my little friend" scene. And he gets shot and he tumbles over a balcony into a pool that might as well be filled with pure irony, out of which is sticking a giant globe around which the words are emblazoned, "The world is yours." Literally, he has gotten the whole world, and yet he has lost himself. It's a very existential film. So the either or here is putting us to that point of the ethical choice, okay? Now we're going to kind of switch gears. We're going to talk about fear and trembling. And I began your selection with an excerpt from Genesis 22. And the real question that we face here is there a teleological suspension of ethics? So just to kind of recap what goes on, and you can read this for yourself, of course. So Abraham had been trying to have a kid for a long, long time. Couldn't have a kid. Finally, when he's old, God says, hey, you're going to have a kid. He says, great. And so he goes and lays with his wife's servant. She has a kid. God says, that's not what I meant. You're going to have a kid. So his wife actually has a kid in her old age. They name this kid Isaac, and the kid grows up, and Abraham loves Isaac. Doesn't really think that much of Ishmael, but that's neither here nor there. That's another thing. So God says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to sacrifice that kid to me. Because remember, this was in the day of like stabbing, bloody sacrifices and burnt offerings and the whole 9 yards. So they go out into the countryside. They're getting ready to sacrifice Isaac. And an angel of the Lord appears and says, stop. Now I know that you believe in me because you didn't hold your only son from me. You may let him go. And they look up and they see a ram caught in the thicket by its horns, and they sacrifice the ram instead, and God is pleased. Abraham and Isaac go back, and Isaac enters years of child therapy. I'm not entirely sure that last part is really biblical. So ethics, if it's going to be universal, is valid for everybody all the time with no exceptions. And the individual has to express himself continually in this universal. So if we suspend something, it's not lost, but we've got to understand it in teleological terms. So the story of Abraham, pardon me, represents a teleological suspension of ethics in this way, okay? Now, Abraham represents faith, and he's acting by virtue of the absurd here. The absurd is he as an individual is making himself superior to the universal. But at no moment is Abraham a tragic hero. He's something quite different. Either he's a murderer or the best believer ever. And Kierkegaard says he doesn't possess this intermediary condition which saves the tragic hero. More on that in just a moment. He says, I can understand the tragic hero, but I can't understand Abraham. Although in an insane sort of way, I admire him more than any other man. Basically what Kierkegaard is saying here is, I wish I had this level of faith, but I just couldn't do it. So, in terms of ethics, Abraham's relationship to Isaac is pretty simple. The father ought to love his son more than he loves himself. And I understand that as a dad. So we're going to see if there's some way that he gets around this. Now, let's talk tragic heroes. Tragic heroes are a literary device, okay? Modern shows, you might say that Jaime Lannister is a tragic hero. If you watch Sons of Anarchy, Jax is a tragic hero. By the way, if you're watching this several years from now, I don't know what to tell you. Go back and watch some good TV. 2019 was a pretty good year. The tragic hero has a lot weighing on him. Hamlet was a tragic hero. So the first tragic hero that we get from a Euripides tragedy called Iphigenia and Aulis. So Agamemnon, remember he was the bad guy in the movie Troy with Brad Pitt, okay? He has just revealed to the young hero Achilles that he's not going to be marrying his daughter Iphigenia, because instead we're going to sacrifice Iphigenia to appease Artemis, who's Apollo's sister, so that the Greek fleet can go across the Aegean Sea to Troy and destroy it. Iphigenia's mother, Clytemnestra, is watching, and aren't these names great? Name your kids these things, bring it back. So ultimately, they sacrifice Iphigenia. Achilles and Agamemnon go across, they defeat the Trojans. Achilles dies there from a shot to the heel, hence the Achilles heel. Agamemnon comes back and Clytemnestra kills him. Then their son Orestes kills her. Okay, so who's the tragic hero in all of this? It's Agamemnon. Now, next one. Chalk this one up to weird stuff you had no idea was in the Bible. So, Jephthah's daughter. This shows up in Judges chapter 11. Basically, you've got this guy named Jephthah. He's fighting this group, the Ammonites, just can't get over on them. And he says, you know what, Lord, I'll tell you what, if you let me beat the Ammonites, whenever I get home, whatever comes out of my door first to greet me, I will sacrifice as a burnt offering to you. You know this isn't going to end well. He's hoping it's his dog or something. So Lord says, cool. He fights the Ammonites, goes home. His daughter comes out to congratulate him, and he's brought low and tears his clothes and all this kind of stuff, and sacrifices his daughter because he promised to do so. Who's the tragic hero? Is it his daughter? No, it's Jephthah. And the daughter doesn't even get a name. How about that? Final tragic hero, we've got Brutus. Who did Brutus kill? Brutus killed Caesar, spoiler alert, who was probably his father. Now, back to Kierkegaard, we get this decisive moment when Agamemnon, Jephthah, Brutus, they've overcome their suffering, they've heroically lost what's dear to them, a daughter, a father. They have only to accomplish this exterior sacrifice, then every noble soul will shed tears of compassion for their suffering, admiration for their deed. And actually, you know, if you read it, it is kind of sad the way it's presented in the plays. But there's a striking difference, says Kierkegaard, between Abraham and the tragic hero. The tragic hero is still in morality. There's kind of a dialectic taking place. In this case, there's no question of a teleological suspension of ethics. There was no question of saving a nation, as was Jephthah. Defending the idea of the state, as was Brutus, or appeasing the anger of the gods, as was Agamemnon. See, even professors forget things from time to time. Abraham's entire action is in no relation to the universal. It's just a private undertaking. He tells us through the tragic hero is great through his moral virtue. Abraham's great through his personal virtue. So why does he do this? For God's sake, because God demands proof of his faith, and for his own sake, because he wants to furnish that proof. Temptations are things that try and stop us from doing our duty. But in this case, it's ethics which tries to prevent us from doing God's will. What do we do with that? Duty in this context is the expression of the will of God. The tragic hero is never in a private relationship with divinity, even if that's what they're reaching out to. So what is the tragic hero good for? Here, let me read you this passage. He visits those who are weighed down by sorrow, those whose lungs cannot breathe enough for their stifled sighs, those whose thoughts hang heavily about them and who are pregnant with tears. He shows himself to them, waves away the magic spells of sorrow, unbinds their bonds, dries their tears, and in the sorrows of the tragic hero, they forget their own. Wow. Now, what does this mean? It means, oh, you're having a bad day? Well, you're not having a Jephthah bad day. Oh, not getting along with your kid? You're getting along better than Agamemnon did. Oh, things are rough between you and your dad. Tell it to Brutus. So it has very much the same effect as like reading Russian literature. If you think your life sucks, believe me, it could always be a little bit worse. Check out Solzhenitsyn and Tolstoy for proof of this. And he says you can't shed tears for Abraham. You can just kind of approach him with a religious horror as the Israelites did Mount Sinai. He kind of brings in the Blessed Virgin Mary sort of oddly, I don't know. Says she needs the admiration of the world as little as Abraham needs tears. She wasn't a heroine, he was not a hero. Only through their tribulations did they become great. And he says it's a great thing to deserve the tears of those who are worthy to shed them. You know, what if you're one of those people who just cries at everything? We all know one of those people. He says the wastewater of blubberers profanes the holy. Instead, it's a great thing that the knight of faith should dare to say to those who do have the nobility to cry for him, do not shed tears over me, but rather shed them for yourself. So where does this leave us? Well, either Abraham is at every moment a murderer, or a potential one, or we're in the presence of a paradox which is just beyond our understanding. The story of Abraham involves a teleological suspension of ethics. As an individual, he makes himself superior to the universal, and that's a paradox which we just can't understand. Kierkegaard is fun to read. One of his statements is, had I to carve an inscription on my tombstone, I would ask for none other than the individual. And I think that should give us some good food for thought. Kierkegaard is the first of three existentialists that we'll be encountering, and does give us a really literary take on it. Sometimes people ask me which of these philosophers is my personal favorite to read. It is far and away Kierkegaard, followed closely secondarily by Aristotle. So that's all I've got for you this evening. As always, if you have questions, drop them down in the comments, put them on the discussion, and I will be happy to get back to you on those. And I look forward to seeing you next week. Bye-bye.